We move on to the fourth and last bit of dirty laundry. The bad popes. This is the biggest slander. The minute someone becomes a pope, he becomes incapable of doing evil. Yeah, what did you put in this iced tea? No. Remember that the very first act of the first pope, the first public act of the first pope, was to deny our Lord 3 times. So, if you get better than that, you're doing pretty good. No, seriously, part of the problem in dealing with the papal question is papal infallibility. Let's get that out of the way before we even look at the historical record. Papal infallibility, despite the popular meaning of the word in English, does not mean that the Pope can do no wrong. That would be impeccability. All infallibility means is that when the Pope speaks intending to bind the entire church by his teaching, in accordance with what has always been taught, because one thing you should bear in mind is that the Pope can't make up new doctrines like the head of the Mormon Church in Salt Lake City can. No. And that's not a jibe, by the way, it's true. I remember when blacks were admitted to the priesthood for the first time back in 76. The Mormon priesthood, I mean, not our priesthood. The Pope, all he can do when there's a question over whether or not a doctrine is part of the original deposit of faith given the apostles, the Holy Ghost will prevent him from teaching, from making an error in this regard. And only 3 times in the past 150 years has infallibility been invoked. Once, oddly enough, with the Immaculate Conception, a doctrine which had been fought over intensely from the time of St. Thomas Aquinas until the 1850s. The Pope defined that Our Lady was in fact immaculately conceived. But he did so after a very long and difficult process. That is an infallible definition that every Catholic has to believe, that Our Lady was conceived without original sin. The second infallible statement in the past 150 years was Vatican I itself, which defined infallibility. And you should read that definition. It's easily available online like everything else now. The reason why you should read it is that it spells out very clearly the limits of infallibility. Bearing in mind that when the Council Fathers were going over this point, they looked at every single example of papal malfeasance they could find, because the definition had to be in accordance with historical reality. And they came up with, though we're not going to be going over them, 44 examples of papal doctrinal error. And so the definition had to take all that into account. The Pope can err, he can even utter heresy as a private theologian, but he will be prevented from doing so when deciding upon this sort of question. The Holy Ghost will prevent him, and that's not always a positive thing either, but he'll prevent him from defining heresy in those specific places and times. What is the third? The third, 1950, the Annunciation of Our Lady, the Assumption of Our Lady into heaven. That was the third and last, so far, infallible definition of the past 150 years. Otherwise, infallibility covers, when it's invoked, it covers the doctrinal decisions of councils and a few other things. So I mention all this because the first reaction is, your Pope's infallible and he did that? Doesn't matter what that was. It's an easy argument to make. Well, yeah. A Pope could be absolutely horrendous. He's no less infallible, bearing in mind what infallibility really means. All right, let's deal now with some of the bad popes. This is the stuff everyone's really waiting for. I guess we'd have to go back to Liberius in the 300s. And during the Arian heresy, he was forced to sign a semi-Arian creed that would appear to be an ecumenical council, the Council of Sirmium. Well, he was forced to do it, but it wasn't binding the church with it. It doesn't affect infallibility. Pope Honorius, he's a real favorite of a lot of people. He actually, during what was called the Monothelite heresy, which argued that Christ had one will. There was two persons in God, but only one will. That was monolithitism. I hate pronouncing that thing. Anyway, Pope Honorius silenced the Orthodox party and was later condemned by an ecumenical council for having done so. Interestingly, that council never claimed that he wasn't the Pope and never claimed that he himself was a heretic, just that he had fostered heresy. Then we move on, really my favorite part of church history, the pornocracy. There's a word for you, pornocracy. Kind of fits to today, actually, but throughout the 900s and into the very early 1000s, the papacy was actually pretty much at the beck and call of for want of a better word, of a series of noble Italian sluts. I mean that nicely. Free and easy girls, filles de joie, anyway, whatever you want to call them. These ladies ran Rome, and they were all related. You know, it was a mother-to-daughter thing. That's why whenever anybody tells you that the church has oppressed women, it's also been oppressed by them sometimes. And obviously, such a person who would say such a thing was never taught by nuns. I can assure you that yes, sister, are two of the most frightening words you'll ever utter in your life. But that's cruel, cheap shot. Anyway, that was the low point of the church's history, without a doubt. And of all those terrible people, my personal favorite was John the 12th. Hateful, hateful, hateful man. John the 12th tried to buy and sell the papacy, sell it anyway, 3 or 4 times, laughingly pocketed the money and said, "You can't sell the papacy, idiot." He was a con man. But wait, there's more. He died in his mistress's arms, wounded by her husband. And I've always said, well, let's see, did that guy go to hell for killing the Pope or heaven for defending the marriage bond? That's one of them questions I'm glad I'm not the judge of the living and the dead over. But he was not a nice person, is what I'm trying to get across. We leave the pornocracy behind, and here, this will come up next month, Vladimir Soloviev made an interesting point about the pornocracy, though, and that was that the patriarchs of Constantinople and the Eastern emperors had no problem with the Holy See when it was in the hands of the pornocrats. It wasn't a problem. As Soloviev says, it was only when the papacy was once again occupied by men of apostolic character that disputes began. So, because you got to say to yourself, wait a minute, why weren't the Orthodox jumping up and down and condemning? I don't know, I wasn't there, despite my age. So, moving along, the next pretty bad pope, I would have to say, was probably, I'd say John the 22nd. John the 22nd was living in the early 1400s. He didn't have a moral issue, thankfully. He had something worse, a doctrinal one. He declared that the just will not see God until the end of the world, until the general judgment. And he imprisoned those who disagreed with him. He did recant on his deathbed, so that's nice. But I've often had people say to me, well, it wasn't defined then. No, you're right, it was defined in the next reign. But saying that doesn't matter is like, well, what if Pius XI had actually denied the assumption before Pius XII pronounced it? You see? Yeah, it wasn't defined yet, but it was the vast majority of people were aware that that was the state of things. So he dies, and we go on to the Renaissance. I know, everybody's favorite, Alexander VI. Well, I got to tell you something funny about him. I'm not going to go on about his supposed crimes and misdemeanors simply because everyone's heard about them or at least seen the Borgias. And as we know, everything you see on television is true. Because they pay a lot of money to get the costumes just right. But there are two schools of thought about Alexander VI. One, that he was what everybody thinks of him as, and the other is that he was just the opposite. And I have read books by both schools, adducing tons of facts. And as I did in my book on the Holy See, on the paper, on the popes, I covered each and every one of them, including him. I threw up my hands with Alexander VI, because they're talking about two different men. So you know what I did, ladies and gentlemen? I put down the arguments of both sides. And I said, you decide, I can't, you choose. So Alexander VI, great saint or great sinner? I don't know. I can't tell you. What I can tell you is that both sides agree he had a tremendous sense of humor. Now, you may recall that there was a recent revival of an old Roman tradition. Prior to 1870, when the popes ruled Rome, the Romans, who were very funny, if you try to take their pope from them, they'll slit your throat. But because he's their pope, they'll treat him like garbage and don't care. It's weird. At any rate, they would put up posters ridiculing the Pope of the day, who was also the temporal ruler. This was a big deal. It became an art form. Well, Alexander VI would have these things collected every morning so he could read them. And he'd laugh. You know, so that's one thing everybody agrees he did. So whatever else, he had a sense of humor, which I'm sure he needed. But then we move on to the last of the real bad popes, Julius III. Julius III was an interesting man. He had been a reform cardinal at Trent, but Trent had not been concluded because an invading army was on its way, so they said, we'll hold out till some other time. And it was not reconvened until after Julius was like the Pope and after. Julius was what we would call today, he had an alternate lifestyle. He picked up a 16-year-old lad on the streets of Naples and made him a cardinal, and built the Villa Giulia, and as the Encyclopedia Britannica says, gave himself up to unorthodox amusements. And that was Julius III. But you know something funny? The reform movement was already underway. Julius III was like a breath of the worst of the old days. And I firmly believe, ladies and gentlemen, that we would not have gotten St. Pius V, for whom even some of the corrupt cardinals voted for, if it hadn't been for Julius III, because the stench he left was so horrible, so awful. Oh yeah, that's right. That's why we had a reform movement. I remember. Yeah. And so we got Pius V. And Trent was concluded. And there was a period of reform in the church. Now, that, going all the way back, is something, and this is the mystery at the heart of the papacy, and why the bad popes are important. They're not important because they disprove papal infallibility. They don't. And they're not important because they show how terrible clergy can be. If you don't know clergy can be terrible, you've obviously never been a Catholic. But they do prove, as you'll see, that the papacy has behind it a mystery. St. Peter, I've told her, denied our Lord 3 times. It wasn't St. Peter then. John the 12th, my personal favorite, yeah, he died in his mistress's arms. He tried to sell the papacy. Horrible man, all that stuff. But he confirmed the Charter of Cluny. And so unwittingly opened up another period of reform in the church. Liberius, wishy-washy, weak, yeah. And he was the one in whose reign occurred the miracle of Our Lady of the Snows, which is why they call St. Mary Major the Liberian Basilica. And if you don't know what any of that means, look it up. I don't want to sidetrack myself further. You may have noticed I'm easily sidetracked by myself. So if you hear something, unless you want to ask me during the questions and answers, write it down and look it up. John the 22nd was the one to whom Our Lady delivered the Sabbatine privilege. So why am I mentioning all this? And Julius III, as I say, horrible man that he was, without him, I doubt we would have had St. Pius V. Alexander VI, even taking him to be the worst possible pope he could have been. He is in very, very truth, in a sense, the father of the Americas. He was the one who approved and encouraged Spain and Portugal to go into the various lands that they were discovering and divided the world between them. One reason why Brazil is Portuguese and the rest of Latin America is Spanish is because of his division of East and West. That's why the Portuguese were in India and the Spanish in the Philippines. We still have, to this day, the effects of that papacy, in a good way. I mean, unless you think that Filipinos being Filipino and Brazilians being Brazilian is bad. But other than that, so bear all this in mind, ladies and gentlemen. There is a mystery at the heart of the papacy. Even the bad popes play their part. Mind you, that doesn't mean you shouldn't resist them necessarily. But it does mean that there is a bigger picture involved. When I look at the history of the church, ladies and gentlemen, you know what I'm always reminded of, frankly? Lord of the Rings. Not simply because of the obvious, but what is Lord of the Rings really? It's what the history of the church in particular, and history in general, is. The working out of God's will through the instrumentation of countless lesser but free wills. He writes straight with crooked lines. And where do you see this in Lord of the Rings? Well, 3 places. First and foremost is the end of the story. Who really achieves the quest of the ring? It's not Frodo, it's Gollum. Gollum saves Middle-earth, despite himself, pursuing his own greed. And Frodo, who like us all is so noble, he's corrupted and is saved by Gollum, whose life he spared out of pity. The weird interconnectedness of life, you see, is what history is all about. A second example in the book, and yes, you're getting free literary criticism that you weren't expecting, so, add it to the bill. You'll recall at one point Gandalf says to Frodo, one thing is certain, Bilbo was meant to find the ring and not by its maker. That's a very clear indication of the divine will at work. And lastly but not leastly, in the appendices, Gandalf is discussing at great length what would have happened had the dwarves not knocked off Smaug. And he points out that it was a chance meeting. He ran into Thorin at the inn at Bree. Thorin told him what was happening, and he said, gee, Willikers, if you're going to do that, you're going to need a hobbit. He says, think of what would have happened. Dragonfire in Lorien, and perhaps Snow Queen in Gondor. It goes through a long laundry list of what would have happened. But none of that came to pass because I happened to meet Thorin Oakenshield one night at the inn in Bree. A chance meeting, as we say in Middle-earth. And that, you see, ladies and gentlemen, is the thing about history, about everything we've been talking about tonight. You say the Crusades, the Inquisition, the colonization with the Indians and the bad popes. Each of these episodes in history was the work of multitudes of people on both sides, on all sides, and all around. And all of them came together and brought us here tonight. We are the summary of that history, for good and for ill. We are part of it. Moreover, ladies and gentlemen, the history that we live through now will be looked back at one day with as much or as little comprehension as we offer the history behind us. I hope that our descendants will look at us as charitably as we look at our ancestors. I would bet on it. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, my narrative comes to an end, and I'm open for questions.